Good morning to everyone. And I want to thank the organizers, particularly the four organizers, for organizing this conference and also for inviting me, for Jerry Harris, Tamara Kubrick, Georgina Murray, and Bill Carroll. I want to say that I thought long and hard about what I was going to talk about here this morning. And as backdrop to what I was thinking about talking about, I have been writing about world capitalism since the 1980s, about globalization since the early 1990s, and about the notions of a transnational capitalist class and a transnational state apparatus since the mid-1990s. Of course, this has been part of a broader collective research agenda in what some of us have referred to as an emerging global capitalism school. And this work has put me in touch with a network of friends and colleagues all around the world researching these matters, including, of course, many of you who are here today. I want to mention in particular my good friend and colleague Leslie Slair. I very much enjoyed his 10-15-minute introduction before he began talking about icons. I enjoyed the icon discussion too. But I also recall, we were recalling when we met here at the conference that we had first met in the late 1990s in New Mexico, and we took a walk through the desert and through some pecan groves, and we spoke about our convergences and a couple of our differences. And we were commenting at that time that we were both, something Leslie said yesterday, we were both ridiculed for our views at that time. So yes, we have come a long way. I'm also happy to say that three of my graduate students are here today. That gives me a great satisfaction. Jeb Sprague, Yusuf Bakr, and Amandeep Sandhu, who's now professor at Temple University. So let me say that my thoughts on globalization have congealed over the past decade into a more synthetic theory of global capitalism as a new epoch in an ongoing and open-ended evolution of world capitalism characterized by novel articulations of transnational social power. Now, what was my original plan for this presentation? I was going to take advantage of such a wonderful opportunity to take stock of my theoretical work on global capitalism, to provide an update of my thinking on these matters, and so forth. And I thought that as well I would respond to some of my critics who, over the last 15 years or so, have said such things as, I do away with the nation states, I do not acknowledge uneven accumulation or uneven development, that I ignore local, national, and regional variation in world capitalism, that I write off imperialism and its practices by the US state, that I overstate the extent to which globalization has equalized conditions for the global production of values, and so on and so forth. These are some of the main criticisms that have been raised on my work. But here's what I want to tell you. I sat in front of my computer for many hours preparing a formal academic presentation on precisely those matters. And then finally I said, wait a minute, this is not what I want to do. And I pressed delete, and I erased about 15 pages. Because I really want to move this talk in a completely different direction. The fact is that our world is burning, that we're facing a global crisis which, in my view, is unprecedented in its scale and in its proportions, and in my view, our very survival is at risk. I believe that the most urgent task of any of us intellectuals who considers him or herself organic is to address this crisis in our intellectual production and in our social activity. At least that's my view, and that's what I intend to speak about this morning. And as a caveat, let me say that I really have a lot to say about this, but I have limited time, even less time, because I got here late. And so I'm going to give you a synthesis of my thoughts on this matter. Let me reiterate that this crisis, in my view, is really unprecedented, given its magnitude, given its global reach, given the extent of ecological degradation and of social deterioration, and given the scale of the means of violence in the world today. We truly face what I refer to as a crisis of humanity, and that's the title of my talk this morning, Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Humanity. Why do I say so dramatically a crisis of humanity? Well, I think we're facing the threat of a global collapse or of a global conflagration of unimaginable proportions. And for that reason, I say that the stakes have never been higher. We have entered a period of great upheavals and of momentous changes and uncertainties, fraught with dangers, if also a situation which presents us with opportunities. We're now also confronting the threat of what I refer to as 21st century fascism, as one of several political responses emerging to the crisis of global capitalism. And if we are to avoid these disastrous possible outcomes, we need to understand two things. First, we need to understand the nature of the new global capitalism, and secondly, we need to understand the nature of its crisis. And this is what I aspire to do in this presentation, to analyze and theorize the global crisis from the perspective of global capitalism theory. Let me suggest that the global capitalism perspective offers us a very powerful explanatory framework for making sense of this crisis. An analysis of globalization not only says something about the nature of this crisis, but even more broadly, it's a template for understanding a broad range of social, political, cultural, and ideological processes in the 21st century. So this is our tool for getting at the roots of what's going on with this crisis. And I suggest that following Marx, we want to focus on the internal dynamics of capitalism to understand the crisis, but at the same time, following the global capitalism perspective, we want to look for how capitalism has qualitatively evolved in recent decades. This system-wide crisis that we're facing is not going to be a repeat of earlier such episodes of crises in the 1930s and the 1970s, precisely because world capitalism is fundamentally different in the 21st century than it was in the latter part and in the earlier part of the 20th centuries. Well, then that leads to the question, how specifically is world capitalism different than during previous episodes of crisis? And I suggest to you that it's distinct because there have been several qualitative shifts in the capitalist system and that I've been focusing on in my work, and I want to highlight what I see as four principal qualitative shifts in the system as we move from the 20th to the 21st century. And the first is the rise of truly transnational capital, the integration of every country into a new globalized production and financial system. This is a transition for me from a world economy characterized by national circuits of accumulation in an integrated international market involving international trade and financial flows to a global economy, or globalized circuits of accumulation, that is transnationalized production in a single globally integrated financial system. And this is a qualitatively new economic structure for the world economy. The second novel element that we face is the appearance of a new transnational capitalist class, here henceforth TCC, and of course that's the theme of this conference, which is a class group grounded in new globalized circuits of accumulation rather than national circuits. Third is the rise of what I have referred to as transnational state apparatuses, conceived as loose networks comprised of supranational political and economic institutions, and also of national state apparatuses that have been penetrated and transformed by transnational social forces. And fourth is the appearance of novel relations of inequality and of domination in global society. So these are, for me, four key elements of what is novel in the 21st century in world capitalism. Now, I've been focusing in recent years on the occurrence and the significance of accumulation and of legitimation crises in the global system. And it's very clear that the collapse of the global financial system in 2008, what many of us have called the Great Recession, was merely the straw that broke the camel's back, so to say. That this, in my view, is not a cyclical crisis that we're facing, but a structural crisis, or what we can more accurately call a restructuring crisis, such as the one we had in the 1970s and before that the 1930s. And also this is a crisis that has the potential to develop into a truly systemic crisis, and whether it does or not will depend on how social agents respond to the crisis, and it will also depend on the element of contingency that's always unpredictable and that always plays a role in historical outcomes. So this current crisis shares several aspects with earlier structural crises of the 1970s and the 1930s, but there are also features that are unique to this present crisis. What is unique to the current crisis? Well, first of all, we can say that the system is fast reaching the ecological limits of its reproduction, and we may have already reached a point of no return. And this dimension cannot be underestimated, although in this particular presentation, I'm only going to mention it briefly. A second novel dimension of this crisis, this 21st century crisis, is the magnitude of the means of violence and of social control, as well as the incredible concentration of control over the means of global communication, the global media, the production and the circulation of symbols. Computerized war drones, bunker buster bombs, Star Wars, and so forth means that the face of warfare has changed. It's fundamentally different in the 21st than in the 20th century. Warfare has become normalized and it's become sanitized for those not directly at the receiving end of armed aggression. And moreover, we've arrived now at the panoptical surveillance society and at the age of what we can really call thought control by those who control the global flows of communications, of images, and of symbolic production. That's a second element, quite novel to this crisis in the 21st century. Yet a third one is limits to the extension of the extensive expansion of capitalism, in the sense that there are no longer any new territories of significance that can be integrated into world capitalism. Deruralization is now well advanced, and the commodification of the countryside and of free and non-capitalist spaces has intensified incredibly. That is, converted in hothouse fashion into spaces of capital. So that intensive expansion of this system, in distinction to extensive expansion, is reaching depths that we've never seen before, that we couldn't even imagine in the 20th century. I want to say on that point that this means incredibly aggressive pressures coming from the system looking for how to continue to expand. And it also means that more and more communities all around the world have no social protection, have no spaces to protect themselves within communities, and are losing their collective groundings in the face of this intensive expansion. A fourth aspect, completely which is novel to this 21st century crisis, is the rise of a vast surplus population inhabiting a planet of slums, alienated from the productive economy, thrown into the margins, and subject to sophisticated systems of social control and to destruction. This is what I refer to as the mortal cycle of dispossession, exploitation, exclusion. This is a point which is really crucial and which I'm going to come back to and explore its meaning momentarily. A fifth thing, which is quite novel to this 21st century crisis, is the disjuncture between a globalizing economy and a nation-state-based system of political authority, and a situation in which transnational apparatuses are incipient and have not been able to play a role of what some refer to as a hegemon. That is, in which the transnational state apparatuses cannot play the role of what we used to refer to as a nation-state hegemon, that is, a leading nation-state that has enough power and authority to organize and stabilize the system. So let us review then, in that context, how the crisis has developed and what this tells us about global capitalism and global society. We can say that emergent transnational capital underwent a major expansion in the 1980s and the 1990s involving hyper-accumulation through new technologies such as computer and information technology, also through neoliberal policies, also through new modalities of mobilizing and exploiting the global labor force, including a massive new round of primitive accumulation involving the uprooting and the displacing of hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of people, especially in the third world countryside, who have become internal and transnational migrants. But then we get to the late 1990s and stagnation sets in and the system starts to face renewed crisis. The ever more acute global social polarization and escalating inequalities, many of us have spoken about that in this conference, fueled over the last years the chronic problem of over-accumulation. The concentration of the planet's wealth in the hands of a few and the accelerated impoverishment and dispossession of the vast majority has really been extreme under capitalist globalization. States previously, under pressure from popular classes and a different correlation of class and social forces, could, or at least did, capture and distribute surpluses to ameliorate somewhat the chronic problems of overaccumulation. And that's not the situation currently in the 21st century. Global inequalities and the impoverishment of broad majorities means that transnational capital simply cannot find productive outlets to unload the enormous amounts of surplus that it has accumulated. So by the 21st century then, the TCC turns to several mechanisms to sustain global accumulation in the face of this chronic overaccumulation. And what are then these mechanisms over the last decade or so? Well, the first I want to emphasize is militarized accumulation, making wars and interventions that unleash cycles of destruction and reconstruction as accumulation. And so this has generated enormous profits for an ever-expanding, what I call, it's quite a mouthful, the military, prison, industrial, security, financial, engineering, and petroleum complex. Now, I say all of that because what I think has gone on here, in part, is that there's been a shift from computer and information technology to that new power block, that new transnational capital power block as the cutting edge of accumulation, worldwide sustaining accumulation in the face of stagnation. And then, of course, we can talk about the financialization of that power block, of that capital power block. So we're really now living in a global war economy that goes well beyond such hot wars as Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. And I want to also say something here as a side note. I suggest that the drive to find accumulation outlets, especially by TCC groups that are linked to that complex that I mentioned, and that enjoy access to US state power, together with the conjunctural circumstances of the last 10, 12 years, is a much more satisfying explanation for the new round of US intervention that we have seen than is the so-called old explanations that we have endlessly debated, and particularly with my colleagues in world systems theory, of so-called rivalry among imperialist powers or efforts to shore up a declining US hegemony, which for me are really outdated explanations for understanding US actions in the world, outdated nation-state-centric explanations. And then we have a second mechanism that set in the last 10, 12 years or so in the face of stagnation, and that is the raiding and the sacking of public budgets by the TCC, using its financial power to take control of state finances and to impose further austerity on the working majority. And of course, this is accelerating as we speak this very moment. The TCC employs its structural power to accelerate the dismantling of what remains of the social wage, of social welfare states, and to claim the future wages of workers through public debt. In other words, you can't accumulate in the present. Well, you accumulate in the future by locking your power onto and control over future wages through the current mechanism of debt. I mean, it's crystal clear in Greece, but it's crystal clear really in many parts around the world. And then the third mechanism that we're also familiar with is frenzied worldwide financial speculation, turning the global economy into a giant casino. The TCC has unloaded trillions of dollars into speculation in the housing market, in food, energy, and other global commodities markets, in the bond market worldwide, that is, into public budgets and state finances, and also into every imaginable derivative, ranging from hedge funds to swaps, to future markets, to collateralized debt obligations, to asset pyramiding, to Ponzi schemes, and so forth. I can't possibly follow all of these mechanisms that have been invented. So those are three mechanisms that are sustaining accumulation in the face of this and in response to this crisis, and as part of the explanation of the crisis. And of course, theoretically, we can see something going on here, which I don't have time to go into, but that states always, and this has been discussed in some of the panels, have always opened up opportunities for accumulation, particularly in the face of capitalist crisis. What we're seeing now, or what we conceive of, is how transnational state apparatuses, which includes the US state as part of these transnationalized apparatuses, are doing so in new ways and very dramatically. But really, the key question now is, with some of that sort of as a framework for understanding some of the crisis and how it's unfolded and so forth, is where is the crisis then headed? What are the possible outcomes to this crisis? What does all of this tell us about global capitalism and about the prospects for confronting global capitalism? Well, there's another question too, which I want to answer, or attempt to answer, and that is, how has the TCC responded to the crisis, both in terms of its direct class interests and in political terms, that is, in terms of its relationship to political processes at the national and the transnational levels? Well, in fact, the TCC has used the crisis to massively pursue its class interests. And of course, that's not surprising, or it shouldn't be, because crisis always is an opportunity for capital. Crisis is also an opportunity for subordinate groups, but that depends on historic and particular political circumstances. So, together with its political agents, the TCC has been attempting to resolve the crisis by launching a war, or intensifying the war that already had been launched on the global working and popular classes. It's undertaken efforts to deepen many times over the so-called, and to consummate the so-called neoliberal counter-revolution that began in the 1980s. And when I say resolved here, I don't mean that making things better for the mass of humanity, but that there is a resumption of sustained accumulation, that is, of profit-making opportunities. For instance, as we all know, Europe and the US now face the same neoliberal policies that have been imposed on the global south since the 1980s, or since before the 1980s. And although transnational capital's offensive against the global working class dates back to the crisis of the 1970s, that's really a key turning point for this globalist stage or epoch in world capitalism, it has grown in intensity ever since then, this offensive against the global working and popular classes. And really, the Great Recession of 2008 was a major turning point in this offensive. In part, as the crisis spread, it generated the conditions for a new round of massive austerity worldwide, including imposing greater flexibilization on labor, austerity programs including the slashing of the social wage, speed-ups wherever we go, and so forth and so on. So the crisis has allowed transnational capital to squeeze more value out of labor directly through more intensified exploitation and indirectly through state finances. And we know that social and political conflict has escalated around the world in the wake of 2008, including repeated rounds of national strikes and mass mobilizations in the European Union, uprisings in North Africa and the Middle East, the upsurge in popular student and worker struggles in Chile, and so forth and so on. We can go around the world and see all of these conflicts bursting at the seams in the face of this crisis. But one thing important to observe here is that although transnational state apparatuses failed to intervene in this crisis, to impose regulations on global finance capital, these apparatuses did intervene and are intervening right now to impose the costs of devalorization on global labor. And here there's a theoretical point, which again I can't get into now, but I want to flag, I want to point out, and that is that this is the function of the transnational state, to generate the conditions for the global accumulation and valorization of capital, and to impose, this transnational state apparatus, new global capital-labor relations. And we're seeing that in the practice as we speak in the context of this crisis. Also, the crisis has provided transnational capital with the opportunity to accelerate the process of forcing greater productivity out of fewer workers. For instance, the largest employers in the US, and I quote here the Los Angeles Times, a recent issue of the Los Angeles Times, have emerged from the economy's harrowing downturn loaded with cash thanks to deep cost-cutting that helped drive unemployment into double digits and resulted in huge gains in worker productivity. And moreover, corporate profits accounted for 88% of economic growth from June 2009 to January 2011, while wages were just 1%, and that's after wages had dropped, so wages took a relative nosedive. While profits of the giant global corporations are booming, and in fact, many of these global corporations are reporting record all-time profits in the midst of this crisis. Now, I want to pause here to comment on two things, because I want to go back to a few points of debate. And I have consistently argued, and I'm not alone in this, Leslie, but many others have also argued that we need to move beyond analyzing these things and analyzing the current global system. We need to move beyond what I refer to as the nation-state-centric framework of analysis. And in part, the nation-state-centric framework of analysis involves also another dimension, which is reification of the state, which we can come back to and discuss afterwards. And so I've been engaged in this debate, which for me are, the crisis not only demonstrates, I think, the more the explanatory power that the global capitalist framework has, but actually, in some senses, the increasing bankruptcy of really even engaging in some of these debates. And particularly, I want to say here, I want to point to the fallacy of outdated theories of imperialism. Now, we can talk about what I mean by that more specifically afterwards, but in which according to these theories of imperialism, the unit of analysis are countries instead of social classes and groups that are operating in countries and transnationally. And so it's claimed in the context of these theories, older theories of imperialism, that what happens is that the core is displacing this crisis to the periphery, or the first world is displacing the crisis to the first world. Well, historically, that might be quite true, we know, but arguments have been made by, among others, David Harvey and Samir Amin, but others, that this is actually what's happening now. But that's actually not. That's really a simplification, and that's ignoring how the crisis is being displaced from capital to workers and popular classes and the unemployed and so forth, right in the very same cities in these core countries and around the world. So we need to get beyond the whole framework of seeing the crisis and global capitalism in these nation-state, interstate terms. That would only be true that there's a core displacing to the periphery the cost of this crisis, and as I've been arguing for some time, if we consider core and periphery not as nation-states, but as transnational social groups, as transnational core and peripheral populations present in all countries and localities. The fact is, as to reiterate, that the traditional core countries are seeing, and such as in the European Union, are seeing the displacement of the crisis to workers and popular classes in the European Union countries as much as to the global working class elsewhere. And on this point, or relatedly, I want to say that just 2 months ago, the General Accounting Office of the US Congress released a report, a remarkable report, an incredible report, in which it said that the US Treasury spent $16 trillion. Now that's an unfathomable amount. $16 trillion between 2007 and 2010 in secret bailouts for banks and for firms as far away as Scotland, Belgium, Germany, Japan, South Korea, France, and India. So this is hardly the behavior, if we want to understand the role of the US state in terms of crisis and global capitalism, of a so-called hegemon trying to shore up its so-called national capitals against rival capitalists. So this debate really, I think, is not at this point really worth the time. Yeah, just spent 5 minutes. The other thing that I want to go back to now, as I said previously, is to highlight that, and this is for me a new structural feature of global capitalism, something structurally new for the 21st century, the rise of surplus humanity. Now, this would be distinct, analytically and empirically, from earlier notions of a reserve army of labor. Yes, we have had a portion of world capitalism, even when you're incorporated, that are unemployed, that's the notions of reserve army of labor, are still very useful and valid, but I'm referring to something different here when I refer to surplus humanity. And this has major implications for political projects, both hegemonic or dominant projects and counter-hegemonic political projects. As I noted, the process of generating greater productivity with less workers has accelerated under globalization and taken even a further acceleration since 2008. The newfound global mobility of capital and new forms of spatial organization has allowed emerging transnational capital to break free of earlier nation-state constraints to accumulation. That, of course, is the process of recent decades. And that is, to be more specific, it has allowed transnational capital to break free of the, in social and class terms, to break free of the power and the ability of working and popular classes to impose those constraints within the bounds of the nation state. That much, what I've just said, is not new. I have been analyzing that and others for the last few years. And I want to deepen that by saying the spatial reorganization helps transnational capital to break the power of territorially bound labor and to impose new capital-labor relations based on fragmentation, on flexibilization, on the intensive disciplining, or the imposition of intensive discipline regimes on workers and popular classes, on the cheapening of labor, all of this together with extracting much higher productivity. So now all of this that I've just summarized in the last minute or so, combined with massive new rounds of primitive accumulation and displacement, gives rise to this global army of superfluous labor. There's a marginalization now of some 1/3 of humanity. As far back as 1996, the International Labor Organization reported that of the economically active population worldwide, 1/3 is unemployed. That's something we have never seen historically. That's something unique to the turn of the century, to the 21st century. This is a mass of humanity, dispossessed from the needs of production, locked out of productive participation, at least in the formal circuits of capital, dehumanized, and subject to new forms of social control and of repression. Again, what I referred to earlier as a mortal cycle of dispossession, exploitation, exclusion. Now, I'm even going to come back once more and elaborate further on that, on the matter of surplus humanity, but first I want to ask, because you'll see the importance here, how have the social and political forces worldwide responded to the crisis? Well, clearly, the crisis is resulting in a rapid political polarization in global society. Both the right and the left-wing forces are insurgent around the world. And there are three identifiable responses to crisis that seem to be in dispute at this point. First is what I refer to as a reformism from above, aimed at stabilizing the system, at saving the system from itself, and from more radical responses from below. Transnational elites, certainly the more far-sighted organic intellectuals among the global power bloc, have proposed a number of reformist measures, including regulating global financial markets. Most recently, you'll remember the French and German heads of state met in Paris just last month to propose some type of a Tobin tax. They have proposed state stimulus programs, fomenting a shift from speculative to productive accumulation, limited redistributive measures, and so forth and so on. The problem is that reform-oriented elites, and some names we can think about are George Soros, Joseph Stiglitz, Jeffrey Sachs, some representatives from the international financial institutes, some governments, some political forces in government, are guided now less by neoclassical than by institutional economics in what some have called pursuing a global Keynesianism. But here's the problem. In the years following the 2008 collapse, it seems that these reformists have been unable to prevail over the power of transnational finance capital, on the one hand. And on the other hand, such powerful transnational capitalists as Warren Buffett and Carlos Slim, you'll see why I'm mentioning Warren Buffett in just a moment, have advanced within the TCC a reformist redistributive discourse. But their eagerness to take advantage of the crisis, to make profits, have prevented them from playing any significant reform role. That's why, just between parentheses, Ralph Nader says we should appeal to the 20 richest men, they're all men, in the world. And of course, it's bankrupt for many reasons, but among that for this one. The example I wanted to give of Warren Buffett is, he came out almost on the same day, when there was this big debate in the US and the Congress on raising taxes and not on the rich to lower the deficit. The same day saying, this is ridiculous, we rich people should pay much more taxes. And on the same day, he spent something like, I don't have the figures in front of me, $15, $20 billion to buy the biggest share of Citicorp. And just by buying those shares, the shares went up, and so he made an additional $300 million on that one day. But now that he's the biggest shareholder of Citicorp, he has to get involved in speculative finance capital, which undermines his very reformist discourse. But there's a second response, putting aside the reformists now, to the crisis, and that is, of course, the popular grassroots and leftist resistance from below. This resistance really appears as insurgence in the wake of 2008, yet it spread very unevenly across countries and across regions. Reflections of this insurgency are the mass uprisings in the European Union countries in the wake of the sovereign debt crises and the imposition of draconian new austerity measures, the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, the turn to the left in the Andean region in Latin America, the revival of labor militancy in the US, or at least we can say in Madison, inside the US. And that's a second response to the crisis. But here's the third response that I want to focus on a little bit here, and it's what I refer to as 21st century fascism. The ultra-right is an insurgent force in many countries. For instance, in Latin America, we can see a 21st century fascism emerging in Colombia, really consolidated in Colombia, in Mexico, in Honduras. We can see ultra-right or neo or 21st century fascist forces rising, gaining terrain in the European Union countries, and of course in the United States, among other places. My fear here is that if reformism from above fails, and if the popular and leftist forces from below are not able to seize the initiative in response to the crisis, the road is going to be open for projects of 21st century fascism. Now, this proto-fascist right, what is it seeking? To fuse reactionary political power with transnational capital. 20th century fascism sought to fuse reactionary political power with national capital. It's seeking to organize a mass social base among historically privileged sectors of the global working class, such as white workers in the north and middle layers in the south, who are now experiencing heightened insecurity and the specter of downward mobility. And this proto-fascist response also involves extreme militarization, extreme masculinization, racism, the search for scapegoats, such as immigrant workers and Muslims in the United States and Europe, and it pursues mystifying ideologies. It often involves race, culture, supremacy, and xenophobia, embracing idealized and mythical pasts. And as well, this proto-fascist right is pursuing a racist mobilization against scapegoats. We should recall in this regard, when we speak about the dangers of a 21st century fascism, that fascism is a particular response to capitalist crisis, and one that seeks to contain any challenge to the crisis that may come from subordinate groups. Now, let me now, in this context of the discussion of 21st century fascism, return once more to this theme which I see as really central, and that is to the matter of surplus humanity. What has taken place through capitalist mobilization is a severing of the logic of accumulation from that of social reproduction. And central to the story of global capitalism and global crisis, as well as to the specter of neo-fascism, is this mass of humanity involving hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, who have been expropriated for the means of survival, yet also expelled from capitalist production as global supernumeraries or surplus labor, relegated to scraping by in this planet of slums and subject to all pervasive and ever more sophisticated forms of repression and social control systems. Now, I really want to emphasize this following point. From the vantage point of dominant groups, the overarching challenge is how to contain this mass of supernumeraries and marginalized and the resistance of downwardly mobile majorities. Certainly, we've been witnessing transitions in this regard from social welfare to social control states. The point is that the need for dominant groups around the world to assure widespread, organized, massive social control of the world's surplus population and of rebellious forces from below gives a powerful impetus to projects of 21st century global fascism. Simply put, the immense structural inequalities of the global political economy cannot easily be contained through consensual mechanisms of social control, that is, through hegemonic domination. So we see an explosive growth in social inequality, an intensified crisis of survival for billions of people around the world, involving the breakdown of the social fabric, at the same time as the state's ability to function as a so-called factor of cohesion, to use Protofascist's term, within the social order breaks down, to the extent that capital has globalized and the logic of accumulation or commodification penetrates every aspect of life, the very life world itself, the community and the collectivity. So that cohesion requires more and more social control in the face of the collapse of the social fabric everywhere. The inability of national states to meet the contradictory functions of accumulation and of legitimation means that economic crisis as it intensifies also aggravates the problem of legitimation for dominant groups, so that accumulation crises appear as spiraling political crises, and that's what we're seeing around the world. And so-called governability, which means the ability to control the population and to create the conditions for smooth functioning accumulation, is ever more elusive. And so states respond with this whole host of mechanisms of coercive exclusion, and that's what we're seeing around the world. Some of these mechanisms of coercive exclusion are legal changes to criminalize the excluded, often racialized groups, and racialized criminalization, and mass incarceration and prison industrial complexes. We see mechanisms of pervasive policing. We see repressive anti-immigrant legislation. We see the manipulation of space in new ways, so that both gated communities of the rich and slums of the poor are controlled by armies of private security guards and technologically advanced surveillance systems. And we see the mobilization of the culture industries to dehumanize the victims of global capitalism as dangerously depraved and culturally degenerated groups. And all of this is coupled with ideological campaigns aimed at seduction and at passivity through petty consumption and fantasy. Now, this last point is crucial. The culture of global capitalism attempts to seduce the excluded and the abandoned into this petty consumption and into this fantasy as an alternative to placing social and political demands on the system through mass mobilization. Now, all of this, it should be very clear, all of this provides fertile bases for projects of 21st century fascism. Images of what such political projects would involve have spanned in the last few years, from the late 2008, early 2009 Israeli invasion of Gaza and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, to the scapegoating and criminalization of immigrant workers in the United States, to genocide in the Congo, to the spread of neo-Nazis and skinheads in Europe, as well as attacks on Muslims, to the United States, United Nations occupation of Haiti, and the Indian occupation of Kashmir. And you might have heard the news last night that I think several hundred mass graves have been discovered in Kashmir in the last day or two. The trashing of Somalia and the explosive spread of the Tea Party and Christian fundamentalism in the United States. Now, with regard to the TCC, it's worth noting as well, in my analysis, that three sectors of transnational capital in particular stand out as the most aggressive in pursuing this agenda and are prone to seeking neo-fascist political arrangements to facilitate accumulation in response to the crisis. These three sectors, I would say, are first, speculative finance, transnational finance capital; second, the military-industrial security complex; and third, the extractive and energy complexes. For instance, why am I saying these three? Capital accumulation in the military-industrial security complex depends on endless conflicts and wars, including so-called wars on terrorism and wars on drugs, as well as on the militarization of social control itself. And with regard to transnational finance capital, that requires accumulating through speculation and manipulation of budgets and so forth, requires ever greater austerity on the mass of workers and popular sectors. And that is becoming difficult, if not impossible, to impose consensually. So then let me stress that if the imperative of social control gives a powerful impetus to the militarization of global capitalism, this militarization has another key function. And that is sustaining global accumulation in the face of stagnation. Militarization, as a response to the crisis of global capitalism, achieves the simultaneous objectives, there are two objectives, of social control and repression on the one hand, and on the other hand, of coercively opening up opportunities for transnational capital to accumulate worldwide, either on the heels of military force, go through the states, contracting of transnational corporations for production and the execution of social control and warfare, and so forth and so on. Examples abound. We could spend hours and hours just looking at these examples. Iraq, now Libya, the occupation of Palestine, the Israeli state loved the occupation of Palestine, independent of any religious or ideological or political, but simply because war on the Palestinians means that it fuels the military technology security industry in Israel, which is one of the biggest in the world. We can talk about the so-called and very misnamed war on terrorism and war on drugs, because it's neither of those, but it fuels accumulation worldwide. And we can talk about the correctly named war on immigrants. We can talk about the mass privatized incarceration systems that are springing up. We can talk about building border walls and so forth and so on. So this is really key, that the generation of conflicts and of repression and of social movements and of vulnerable populations around the world is an accumulation strategy independent of any political objectives. That's very important, and it lends itself to 21st century fascism. This type of permanent global warfare involves both low and high-intensity wars, so-called humanitarian missions, drug interdiction operations, securing borders, all of this in quotes, anti-Gaddafi interventions, and so forth and so on. The example of the war on immigrants in the United States and the criminalization of immigrants is really extremely enlightening. There's no time to go into it. I'll just mention one detail. The Corrections Corporation of America constructs private detention centers for immigrants in the United States. Every time an immigrant is arrested and put in the detention center, they make a profit. And so it's no wonder that the Corrections Corporation of America, together with several other corporations, have been writing these anti-immigrant bills for all of these in the United States, which criminalizes immigrants. So every time an immigrant is detained, and the shareholders, and this is a publicly traded company in Wall Street, the shareholders could care less if there's immigrants or there's non-immigrants. Actually, they want the more immigrants, the merrier. And so repression, introducing immigrants, and then repressing immigrants, and introducing them and repressing them, and detaining them and deporting them and so forth, is a multi-billion dollar industry. And for accumulation, independent of any political or social or cultural issues. So I can't take up any of this any further in detail, this issue of, I need to move towards a conclusion. But this issue of 21st century fascism, I want to say that I've been doing a lot of thinking and writing about and my friend and colleague, Mario Herrera, and I finished a very lengthy article specifically on the issue of 21st century fascism, and didn't come out in time for this conference, but it will be, it's in press with the journal Race and Class, which is based in London. It will come out in their January issue, and there'll be, if you want more detailed discussion on that particular dimension, 21st century fascism. So as I move to a conclusion, I want to stress, though, that 21st century fascism would not look like 20th century fascism. I often get in debate with colleagues and say, well, no, look, this was Mussolini and Nazis. Well, we're not talking about that. The ability, among other things, is not going to look, it wouldn't look the same, because the ability of dominant groups to control and manipulate space and to exercise unprecedented control over the mass media, over the means of communication, the production of symbols and images and messages, means that repression can be more selective, as we see with crystal clarity, for instance, in Mexico or in Colombia. And also, it can be organized, in quotes, juridically, so that mass legal incarceration in the United States takes the place of concentration camps. And as I speak, 5 million people, vastly disproportionately black and Latino in the United States, are inside the penal system. And at any one day, 100,000 immigrants are detained in these private, for-profit detention centers. As well, the vast new powers of cultural hegemony open up new possibilities for atomizing and channeling grievances and frustrated aspirations into escapism and consumerist fantasies, which makes 21st century fascism a bit more of a different project than we saw in 20th century fascism. In that regard, the fashion and entertainment industries, we know, market anything that can be converted into a commodity. And with this comes depoliticization. At best, if not the ability to channel fear into flight rather than fight back. Moreover, the ideology of 21st century fascism often rests on an irrationality, on vague or coded promises to deliver security and to restore stability. And this is emotive, not rational. 21st century fascism is a project that does not and need not distinguish between the truth and the lie. And this is why some of you, not from the US and from the US, will see that some of these massive crowds of the Tea Party say the most absolutely absurd things, like Obama is a socialist that's going to bring our socialism. Truly wish that were true. But there's no relationship between the truth and the lie, and between any rational thinking about what's going on in the world. But that's this project of 21st century fascism. These new modalities of social control and ideological domination now blur boundaries so that there may be constitutional and normalized neo-fascism with formal representative institutions, with a constitution, with political parties and elections, and all the while, the political system is tightly and repressively controlled by transnational capital and its representatives. And if you want a perfect model for that, which is already in existence, it's Colombia. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the case of Colombia, but the model worldwide for a perfect system of 21st century fascism. Now, in conclusion then, barring the overthrow of global capitalism and any resolution of the crisis from the vantage point of the vast majority, this must involve a global redistribution downward of income. And this, in turn, the distribution downward of income, would have to involve achieving state intervention, regulation, and redistributive mechanisms that state elites so far have been unable or unwilling to undertake. And it would also mean reining in on transnational finance capital, which, as we know, is the most globalized and most globally mobile fraction of capital. So here we see the contradiction that I mentioned at the beginning, what's unique to this 21st century crisis, between globalized capital and a nation-state-based system of political authority. And we see this structural power this disjunction gives the TCC, especially to finance capital, as we see in Greece and so forth and so on. And we also see the incredible penetration that the TCC achieves of national state apparatuses in pursuit of its interests, such as in the United States, where transnational corporations now are considered people and can give unlimited funding to political parties and to campaigns and to individuals for that matter. So that as never before, as we've never seen before, economic power translates into political control and power to determine political outcomes. Now, the more enlightened among the transnationally oriented political and economic elites, as I mentioned, have been clamoring for transnational state apparatuses that could impose some global regulation and interventionist capacity to help restabilize the system. That is the political protagonism of the international stage, for instance, of the BRIC countries and China and so forth, completely misunderstood as rivalry between North and South, a rivalry among national states. And that, of course, is thrust behind this German-French proposal for a Tobin tax. And it remains to be seen what headway these efforts will make. But of course, the point here in concluding is that the viewpoint from the viewpoint of those from below, the objective is not just projects of redistribution within the prevailing global power structures and the prevailing socio-economic system, but of redistributing power downward and transforming the system. So what types of transformation? We could imagine democratic socialism, which I believe we need to put back on the global agenda, but also new forms of production and collective laboring and consumption that are in harmony with nature. New forms of political organization in which the grassroots base and social movements empower themselves to exercise democratic control from below to above and not the reverse. And building or renewing cultures of social solidarity, of community, and of transnational resistance. And I think here we can take inspiration from, for instance, Los Indignados in Spain, the popular sectors that filled Tahrir Square in Egypt, the indigenous movements in the Andean region, the workers in Madison, the shantytown movements in South Africa, the students and the workers in Chile, and so forth and so on. We really need to, and now is not the time or the place, at least for me to do so, but we need to theorize and conceptualize these new movements and their emancipatory potentials, as well as their limitations. And there are big debates, which I can't get into here, but certainly on what's the role of political vehicles and so forth and so on. But let us recall that it is in times of crisis that space is opened up for collective agency and for contingency to influence the course of history in ways not possible in times of stability. And so in this regard, how masses of people understand the nature of the global crisis becomes itself a critical battleground in struggles for alternative futures. Hence, crucial to any struggle in global society to confront the war unleashed against the global working and popular classes is to provide coherent explanations of the crisis and of possible solutions from a working class, leftist, and democratic socialist-oriented perspective. That's a part of the value, and that's where organic intellectuals and socially committed scholars come in. In my view, in conclusion, the only viable solution to the crisis of global capitalism is a massive redistribution of wealth and of power downward towards the poor majority of humanity along the lines of a 21st century democratic socialism, and in which humanity is no longer at war with itself and with nature. Otherwise, I fear that humanity may be headed towards a conflagration that could put an end to all of us, or towards what some have called a new dark ages. Thank you.
The people who want to raise their hands. Okay.
I'd like to maybe focus more on the response. Like, what can we do given the crises that you've outlined? And just in response to some of your suggestions, Phil, about where the promising projects are or what kinds of projects are needed to respond to these crises, I would say that we need to think beyond the Arab Spring and the insurgencies that are emerging. Not to say that those aren't important, but I think where we can contribute most as organic intellectuals, scholar activists, is through things like the World Social Forum process, which I spoke about yesterday, because that is, well, in many ways overlaps in membership with these insurgencies. Perhaps not enough, but it can be expanded. But the World Social Forum process is actually doing this work to spread alternative analyses and projects and actually model forms of democratic socialism and alternative economic models and spread them worldwide through local, national, regional, and world forums and these ongoing network processes that have really been continuing for 10 years now. So perhaps we can shift some of our intellectual attention and energies to thinking about these structures of movement rather than pinning our hopes on spontaneous insurgencies that are responding to more immediate conditions or crises.
Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions that
Well, thank you for your excellent general overall global picture. We have a social and economic polarization, both in the north and south, you're right. But witnesses a third worldization of the rich countries. And you pointed out Colombia, Mexico, and Honduras. Well, in Mexico, we have the richest men in the world, you know. And at the same time, we have the destruction of social fabric, violence, parliament errors, electoral frauds, drug leaders, young people now looking for chemical fertilizers, you know, drugs, cheap drugs, like crack, you know. So, you're right. It's funny that in Colombia and Afghanistan, where there are American troops and a lot of influence from the international capital class, they have the largest production of drugs, you know, in the world, in Afghanistan and Colombia. So, my question will be, could you more or less separate the strategies for global and local struggles. I mean, we live in a globalized world. Of course, we have some global problems, and also global. How can we fight against this possibility of a new kind of fascism all over the world? I think, well, I'm a physicist, I'm not a sociologist. I just find out about this US Social Forum. And I think as scholars, we have to be able to, look for disseminate all the information as possible, okay? And my question is, there are also social forums in Asia, in Europe. How can we organize globally and locally?
Okay, let's take one more question. Actually, those two questions are very similar. There's actually one question. Okay, why don't you answer it?
Well, both Jackie and Marcelo are, the nature of the question is, well, what do we do? And of course, I don't have the answers. I'm going to give my views on what you said, but of course, that's our collective task, and not just both as organic intellectuals that we are, but collective task of masses of people that need to change the world. So I of course don't have the solutions, but I would say with regard to Jackie that you're emphasizing the World Social Forum, and if I could analyze a bit, what's behind that emphasis, which I agree with, and that there's the need to build organizations and to build networks and to build alternative programs and projects, and that type of drawn-out struggle, which is absolutely crucial and lays the bedrock for change, is extremely necessary, and moreover, to the greater extent that those networks and those alternative programs and those social movements are active around the world and interlinked, when there are spontaneous or conjunctural uprisings, such as in the Middle East, that gives it direction. So the examples that I gave about this rapid polarization and explosion since 2008 are real examples, and I want to respond to them momentarily. But they're not in contradiction, on the contrary. I agree with what you're saying. At the same, and so I'm not pinning my hopes on the spontaneous, but the other thing is I'm not so sure that they're so spontaneous. I think that's a misreading from afar. Certainly, there's two factors we could say, just to take the example of the Middle East and then the example of Chile and the example of Madison, or just Chile and the Middle East. In Egypt and in the Middle East, what's taking place is incredible neoliberalization and integration into global capitalism in recent decades, which has resulted in the rise of transnationally oriented fractions, both in the state and out of the state, and the whole change in the economic and productive structure, notwithstanding that oil continues to be a bedrock, and the displacement of millions of people and new flexibilized working classes and attacks on unions. All of that's taking place in Egypt. And one of the problems is that the political structure in many of the countries in the Middle East is not very useful for global capitalism in the Middle East. At the same time, as all the displacement involved with global capitalist penetration has made this massive resistance and discontent from below. And so really, if you look in the larger picture, I don't think it's so spontaneous, and I think if you look at Egypt, there are trade unions, a very strong trade union movement, there are left groups that are very small, there's women's movement and so forth. So on the one hand, I agree with you on the need for more long-term, the hard work of, what did Gramsci call it, molecular organizing, at the level of us little ants. And on the other hand, though, we don't want to simply write off what we're seeing here as spontaneous. Certainly in Chile, the rebirth of this massive movement in Chile, which is changing the whole political face of the Southern Cone right now, is nothing really not spontaneous at all. But I can't agree more with the emphasis on the World Social Forum, and not just the World Social Forum, but the need also, and I'll make one other point with regard to Jackie, to your comment. One of the big debates in the World Social Forum, and that I mentioned very briefly in my presentation, is what is the role of political parties? Political parties are not allowed to go to the World Social Forum. Okay, we don't need to debate that. But here's the thing, I continue to believe, unlike a lot of this thinking, that we do also need political vehicles. So there's social movements from below have ways of engaging directly with states and institutions. But the problem is not the type of political vehicles where from top down, the old type of vanguardisms of the 20th century. We need new ways of conceiving of how do you build political vehicles which can aggravate diverse interests and diverse social movements and yet control those political vehicles. And it's not clear, because look at what's going on in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Venezuela. It's not clear how you do that. With regard to what Marcelo was asking is, can we separate the strategies of global and local struggles? And I argue for quite a long time now, and it's hardly even just my argument, and probably everyone here would agree, certainly Jackie would, among others, that we can't possibly, and that the only way to confront global capitalism is to transnationalize resistance. And so it's always, though, historically, that dominant groups take some the lead in something in their own interest because they have power and so forth, and then resistance catches up. Now, that's not always the case. One, that it catches up, or it's not always the case that resistance isn't in the forefront in the first instance. But I think currently it was capital and its agents that globalized, and resistance is now catching up in terms of its globalization. But of course, the trick here is how you link local to national, national to regional, and regional to global struggles and projects. And I don't have the answer, but that's how we need to be thinking.
Well, that's a very powerful narrative, and I completely agree with your conclusions. In fact, there's a new e-journal, Journal for Democratic Socialism, which I think I'm on the editorial board of, I'm not quite sure. But it's starting very soon, and what you just said, you don't have the answer, none of us have the answer, but maybe we can continue this debate partly through this journal. I've contributed something to the first issue, which is coming out, it may well be online now, Journal for Democratic Socialism. Now, let me just challenge you on some of the details of your analysis, because I think the historical analysis leads you to certain conclusions about how to proceed from there. And really what I want to challenge you on is your very ambitious claims of the novelty of this crisis. Now, my feeling is that if you've been talking in the 1930s or the 1970s, you would have said pretty much the same, with one very big difference. And in my view, the only novel aspect of this crisis is a consequence of the electronic revolution. So, much against my better judgment, I've reverted to Marx's technological determinism. But in this case, I think it's really powerful. Because all of the things that we've talked about can be, people who are less sympathetic to you than I am would simply say it's the quantitative to qualitative argument. Where does ease of communication morph into a qualitative change? And I think we really need to study this very carefully. And that's where, historical studies and case studies become very valuable. For example, with global slums, it's just not true. I mean, Mike Davis's book is a fantastic expose of the current situation. But relatively speaking, the situation is probably better than it was in previous decades, in the 19th century, for example. Which is not, you see, the problem is that whenever you say something like that, people think we're very complacent about the present. I'm just trying to put it in perspective. In terms of global poverty and the unemployed, that's completely untrue and it completely neglects the distinction between the formal and the informal sector. And again, it's not to be complacent, but all over the world there are millions of people who don't appear on any, billions of people who don't appear on any employment registers, who make just about a subsistence living, not satisfactory, from their informal activities. So the novelty of the present crisis, I think, can be overstated. However, there are two respects which I've already indicated. One is class polarization. So the people who've been able to benefit from the new technology is a vastly expanded class. And I think we really have to factor this in. I completely agree with you about the middle being squeezed in a way that's been unprecedented in the last 20 or 30 years, and the stubborn problem of the very, very poor, which Marek, I think, brilliantly exposed in his talk the other day. What I want to ask you very directly is, in what way does your analysis differ from my very simplistic analysis of this classical crisis of capitalism of overproduction and underconsumption? What's the real difference? I think it's just the same thing. And just to conclude, let me just say that I think we underestimate the crisis of the transnational capitalist class, because to implicate them in a process to just get rid of this surplus population is completely self-defeating for capital, especially global capital, because what it has to do is it has to bring these people in as consumers. The only way to bring these people in as consumers is to raise their wages and to bring them into the wage economy. But how do you do this and keep profits up? Now, your quote from the LA Times, I think, is an excellent example of the way in which this crisis is insoluble under capitalism, the capitalist mode of production. I cannot, of course, conclude without a pop at the transnational state analysis. And let me just state once more, I'm very much opposed to it. I think it's a complete red herring, and it does distort the whole picture. You read what sounded like a brilliant example from the GAO report about the US taxpayer bankrolling Scottish banks and banks all over the world. This is not the US state talking and acting. This is the globalizing, this is the state fraction of the transnational capitalist classes, the globalizing politicians and bureaucrats who have infiltrated the GAO like they've infiltrated lots of other agencies, but not all agencies of the state in the US and around the world, to help themselves. It would be very interesting to look at the top personnel of the GAO and see what their linkages are with the major banks around the world. Now, let's have a little bet. $10, that there's quite a lot of interlink there, former bankers backwards and forwards. There is certainly all over the world in all the major institutions. A lot more I could say, but a powerful narrative.
I just want to add one very short question, and in terms of time, we'll let Bill mainly respond to Leslie here, and then we'll take our coffee break. My short question is, part of the left strategy in response to fascism in the 1930s was to call for a popular front with anti-fascist sectors of the capitalist class. Is that part of your strategy for confronting fascism today?
Appreciate, Leslie, tremendously your comments, and I'd like to have the time, which I don't, to respond in more detail to the texture. Response really needs to be textured and as complex as the commentary in which you're getting it. So I'm going to do my best in just a few minutes. With regard to the Journal of Democratic Socialism, and I was going to say this in commenting on Jackie's and Marcelo's comments, that I think part of the struggle here is also regenerated ideological struggle, and part of that involves relegitimating socialism. And so it's great that that journal is out, and I think that's part of our job if we want to consider ourselves organic intellectuals of an anti-capitalist alternative. Now, one thing that Leslie said is he's not quite clear to the novelty of this crisis. If I went back to the 30s, it would sound like, 70s, it would sound like I'm saying this is novel compared to the 30s. Well, it was. The crisis of the 1970s had novel elements with regard to the crisis of the 1930s. This crisis has novel elements with regard to those two 20th century crises. Every crisis, first of all, is going to be novel because they're going to be historic conjunctions that are not repeated. Such that the convergence between structure and structural patterns and particular historical ways in which history unfolds and contingency and so forth. But more than that, and of course there's the underlying debate there is when you say that you don't see the crisis as novel, you might as well say you don't see global capitalism as novel. Because obviously when I say global capitalism is novel, I don't mean that there are not deep continuities, that it's not the capitalism we've had for 520 years. What I mean that it's constantly open-ended, it's constantly evolving, it's constantly transforming, and there are qualitatively new circumstances in which we look at world capitalism. And I know that you and I see eye to eye on that, and I'm saying the same thing with regard to this crisis, but really in a hands-on way. I don't see how someone could say that some of the things I pointed out are not novel. The nature of warfare, that in Utah, a contingent of the US Air Force and Special Forces sits in an underground bunker in Utah, looks at computer screens, and kills Pakistanis with drones. Okay? And then, and the total, this unbelievable control. The war after Vietnam, the US state, you want to call them state capitalists, whatever they were, but the people around the US state and the Pentagon said, the next war will not be televised. Okay, or it will be televised under our terms. And so, I mean, so just the nature of war. In the 1970s, the crisis was resolved for capital by this tremendous new expansion. The former Soviet bloc countries collapsed, and so you could massively move in there with investment, capture new markets, and so forth. Third world revolutionary states collapsed, everything from Southern Africa to collapsed or either transformed. China opened up and became, well, we can debate whether it's capitalist or not, but became part of the global capitalist economy. And so there was all of these possibilities for extensive expansion. So it is novel, in my view, for me to say that now we're facing this crisis in which capital doesn't have new regions to conquer and bring into the world market. So that's novel as well. I mean, and we can go on. The points that you make about what you see as not novel is global slums, and by the way, I never mentioned global poverty. It's global inequality, which is very important, the distinction. Inequality is a social relationship. And poverty, we can also say poverty is a social relationship, but let's just say for argument's sake, it's a condition. And my concern analytically, not normatively, but analytically, is not the question of poverty, but one of inequality, which is a relation of domination. And so that's what I'm getting at. But also the global slums in the informal sector. You have a mass of people which were not in the informal sector as we need it when we talk about the 21st century. You have a mass of people that were still tied to pre- or semi-capitalist existence in the countryside, whether peon labor in Latin America, whether small commodity producers with their farms, under Chinese rural, land redistribution and Asian land redistribution. You don't have that. Now you have people surviving. Right, they're not unemployed, they're surviving or trying to survive in an informal economy. But that's a qualitatively distinct situation, or is moving towards something different than what we had in the 20th century, where many people were outside of world capitalism, not in market relations, but a direct, were not displaced from the means of production, but incorporated in quite a number of ways. So I think there are qualitative, something qualitatively new about surplus humanity, and the political importance of that I really tried to stress in the presentation, what it means in terms of the need for social control and domination. But also, and Leslie started to say something, I thought you were going somewhere else because you said because there are other groups beyond this polarization of 2 or 3% at the top and the masses below that benefit from global capitalism. That's another discussion. But since you started to mention that, I'll certainly say that in China, the people that like to apologize for global capitalism say, well, look at this middle class in China, which is now consuming and yet fueling growth or sustained accumulation, is 300 million. Maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, while 800 million have gone down and face the precarious conditions that have elsewhere. Same thing in India. And finally, that's the next thing right in my points. You said a lot, so I took careful notes. So, and what is the difference? Well, it's not. I've never suggested in this presentation that capitalism is still not capitalism with its internal contradictions. That's why I began by saying we start the story with Marx's analysis of the dynamics of capitalism. The dynamics of capitalism is overproduction under consumption, but I'd rather assume that under what I see as overaccumulation, but that's just, we can say, not relevant. So I've never argued. I never said that something new is overaccumulation. But overaccumulation is now taking place within the novel circumstances of globalized capitalism and this particular crisis. That was the point. Finally, Leslie, and there's more points, but we can't get to them. But the transnational capitalist class, if I gave the impression that the transnational capitalist class is confident and able to deal with all of this and not itself in crisis, then I gave the wrong impression. Because the capitalist system, the system, and any relations of domination mean permanent crisis, means that hegemony and forms of domination have to permanently struggle to be sustained and to be renewed. So, but here's the thing, and here's where I disagree with you, and I'll conclude my response to you, and then very quickly to Jerry. I think that's as far as we get. I am a Marxist, and I'm proud to say so. Marxists can't exist. Capital can't exist without the state. the individual capitalists, the transnational capitalist class, at the level of individual enterprises and individual groups, do need to redistribute income downward for their own good. But they can't. It's the nature of capitalism. They can't. They need some collective political authority which will look beyond their, and I'm not saying this is Marx, but I agree with Marx, which will look beyond their immediate interests. And that collective political authority is for me the state. So I can't possibly expunge the state from the analysis. I know you're shaking your head, I know you disagree. But when we walked through the desert, just so I can conclude with Leslie, we walked through the desert and we identified two disagreements and we analyzed them, and I think that they're still there. I converged a tremendous amount with Leslie. But I mean, one was I don't agree that state officials and that high-paid journalists or so forth, or culture industry people, are capitalists. I stick to the more traditional definition of the capitalist class as those that owns the means of production itself and employs labor to generate surplus value. So these are allied strata and sectors and classes. So that's one difference we have, and we don't need to agree on that. But the second one we walked through the desert, you remember, is that how do we look at the state and is it necessary to analyze the state? And I still continue I think we need to get rid of our old ways of looking at the state, and particularly the national state. And that's why when other critics have bombarded me with their criticism. But I think it's very important to analyze how global capitalism is institutionalized and what types of political authorities emerge as allied strata or as political representatives of the TCC. And so this is an ongoing debate that we have. We're not going to resolve it now. Jerry, this will be very quick. Thank you for bringing that up. And actually, this article that I wrote, and my thinking, together with Mario Barrera, and my thinking on this is absolutely, in fact, you mentioned that, we need to go back and resurrect an idea of very broad class and social alliances, and popular alliances, if you want to call it a popular anti-fascist front, we could call it that. With the one distinction that, or the one emphasis that, in which popular working class radical forces exercise a hegemony within a popular front, rather than, for instance, in the US, the left wing of the Democratic Party exercising hegemony within a popular front. And so that's tied to the issue of how the social forces from below can their agenda, not sacrifice their agenda of popular change, and at the same time enter into alliances with other groups. And we don't have the answer to how it happens, but yes, I agree that that's what we need to be thinking. Thank you.